Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Noshin Premji, and I am the Projects and Events Coordinator here at the Institute of Ismaili Studies. It is with great pleasure that I welcome you to this evening's book launch, Women, Households and the Hereafter in the Quran, a Patronage of Piety. A special welcome to all of those of you who are joining us online from wherever you are and from whatever time zone you're joining us from. We will start tonight's launch with opening remarks from Professor Zain Qasim, the director of the Institute of Ismaili Studies. And this will be followed by a lively discussion with the authors, Doctors Karen Bauer and Faraz Hamza, who will be in conversation with Dr. Omar Ali Unzaga, who is the series editor for the Quranic Studies series, and Dr. Ziba Mir Husseini, legal anthropologist and activist. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce the director of the Institute of Ismaili Studies, Professor Zain Qasim, for a few words.
Well, it's lovely to see you all here in this beautiful building on a very lovely afternoon. I see that the sun has made an appearance again after sort of playing hide and seek all day. And nothing thrills me more than to actually have a book launch on a subject that's very dear to my heart, having spent almost 30 years teaching courses on women in Islam. So, I have recently come from North America, and when you teach women in Islam in North America, it really is challenging because North American students, by and large, come with some predetermined notions about what it means to be a woman in the Islamic Eight world. That you are oppressed by your men, your tradition oppresses you, the Quran is a heavily patriarchal text, women have no rights. I've even been told by students that, we treat dogs better here than you folks do women in your parts of the world. And as we know, the notion of saving women in Afghanistan was famously put forward by Lynn, what's her name, Bush? No, Laura Bush, to sort of be partially justification for invading Afghanistan. And, the thing is that Western feminists, and this is, as you know, also being noticed in some of the geopolitical events going on today, that Western feminists don't always kind of identify with women in other parts of the world for whom they should also be struggling to put up the good fight and doing the intersectional work that we know in feminism generally, and which is why we like feminist theory by and large, because it gives us some useful tools. So the issue is that, to try and convince people that patriarchy is actually a global issue, that violence against women is a global issue, that it is not actually, colonized, neither violence nor patriarchy have been colonized by the Muslim world, let alone the Asian world, let alone the North African or the Middle Eastern world, or the South American world, which are all essentially places of color, or the East Asian world. But rather, these are global phenomena that we, those of us who kind of believe in the dignity and the equality of all creatures, human, animal, and otherwise, that these are principles that are actually human principles that we should try and uphold wherever in the world they're found. So you can imagine, that coming in as a student of, and I don't mean to make this a lecture, but coming in as a student of Islamic and Indian philosophy, so my world is the medieval world, to be told on the first day when I arrive at my new job at Pomona College, which is a very distinguished liberal arts college in California in the US, to be told by my chair that I had to teach a course on women in Islam. And so after voraciously reading anything and everything, and I think at that time it comprised maybe 2 shelves of books, you can imagine finally my delight when I came across some academic tools that were going to be really helpful for me in my work. One of them was reading Denise Candiotti's essay on negotiating with patriarchy, because it kind of restored the one thing that I was unable to find in all the reading I had done, which is, the importance of agency and how women have mobilized their agency in order to negotiate with patriarchy because they know they cannot get rid of it. So that gave me a very important theoretical tool to share with my students with respect to how it is done. And the example for how it is done came from Ziba Mir Husseini's work, which is where we read her comparative study of Islamic marriage courts in Iran and in Morocco, because that's where she very deftly kind of shows how, it actually, that book puts so many stereotypes about Muslims and women and Muslim men to rest, because it kind of shows that, when there are ways forward for upholding the dignity of women, they're followed. And that Sharia gives the space for that. It's not always a successful fight, but actually it's there. And for students to be able to see those nuts and bolts examples, was really, really important. This is now what brings me to Karen and Firas's books. I really don't think the two of them need an introduction. I mean, Karen is an associate professor here. Firas has been off doing wild and wonderful things in parts of the world, and we hope to string him back to the Institute. Ziba Mir Husseini, of course, is very well known to you because she has written books that will change your mind on whatever it is you thought you knew, because she will make a difference. And Omar, I cannot say enough good things about Omar, because, the conversations alone are makes it worthwhile for me to have crossed the ocean to have come over here. But in any case, one of the things that Karen and Firas's book does is that it kind of shows how the Quran, which is by outsiders considered to be a very patriarchal text, actually, looks at the relationships and the role of women and their situatedness in the household in ways that could be thought of differently when you look at them through the lens of piety. So that last sentence was perhaps totally incomprehensible to you, but I'm going to leave it to them to tease it all out, okay, if that's okay.
So I think I'll give a couple of minutes of introduction to this book and how it came about. We had worked together for some years on a different book, what's called the Anthology of Quranic Commentaries. And as the name suggests, that's an anthology. It's translations of primary sources. And they were commentaries on the Quran, on women, on certain verses of the Quran that had to do with women. And at a certain point, I had worked with those commentaries even before we got together to translate them into a work that could be used by anyone in classrooms. And, at a certain point, in this journey of understanding interpretations of these verses, we said to ourselves, actually, we can't leave it with the interpretive tradition. We really should say something about the Quran itself, right? We've been talking a lot about how the interpretive tradition is grounded in particular times and places. We've shown this. We can see that all the interpreters are negotiating the text through their own circumstances and their own preconditioned dispositions and ideas. So what about the thing, the object itself? What we haven't said, are we saying enough about that? So we started out thinking, well, let's do a chapter on women in the Quran for this anthology. We gathered together every verse in the Quran that had anything to do with women, the feminine, any mention of daughters, of anything feminine, even the mothers, anything like that. We gathered them all together, and we thought, let's do a methodological experiment here, doing something that has been done in the field of Quranic studies, but that has never really been applied to the subject of women, which is, let's put these in what we suppose to be maybe a chronological order of the revelation, like the earliest verses, then coming the slightly later verses, and then the last verses that came about, say when there was maybe more of a state and a polity. So the movement of the nascent community is tracked in this way. And the Quran itself is not arranged chronologically. It's not that type of a text. And so we had to excerpt the verses and put them in that order. And suddenly this picture began to emerge that we hadn't expected. And we could tell a story of that development of women in the text. We started to tell the story. We wrote 10,000 words. We wrote 20,000 words. We wrote 50,000 words. We said, this is a pretty long chapter. So we gave it to our editor, and we we said, hang on. We kept writing 70,000 words, 75,000 words. We said, we think this could be a book. We spoke to Omar. We said, can we excerpt parts of this and make it into a chapter? Yes, but actually just keep writing the book. Suddenly we had, I don't even remember how many words it ended up being, 150,000 words. I don't know, something like that. And yeah, and so there is a chapter in that anthology, but that which represents our nascent understanding. And then there is now a book that represents much more of what we understand the Quran to be saying, which is significantly different from what we think that the tradition said about it. And that's how this came about.
And I guess we also discovered, and I think this is for us even more important, that that this methodological read of the Quran for us uncovered a kind of relationship between concepts which are difficult to square together, hierarchy and justice, for example. So social inequality and moral agency, for example, that, depending on your social status, what can you do? What can you do about your situation, wherever it might be, or however it might be configured? So we learned, I think, to see the Quran as a moral framework, as a moral vision, which was urgent, and urgently kind of narrated in the Quran. There's a sense of urgency about moral transformation. And then surely the idea that the Quran is concerned with justice, it's a message that's supposed to kind of emancipate people. So one assumes that it wants to do good things. You then have to square it with 1,000 years plus of, a very peculiar jurisprudential reading of Muslim societies and of the status of women as well. Mm-hmm. So I think we learned much more, having kind of, as Karen was saying, looked at the chronological development of women in the Quran and how they acquire importance. Of course, one of the other things that we ought to say is that it's a topic such as, the Houris ends up displacing, women in the Quran.
Yeah.
And it's that kind of discourse problem that we always have. It's like, how do you teach a course on jihad? We did that yesterday with your students. Do you start by talking about Rambo before you talk about the Quran? Yes, of course. Mm-hmm. Fortunately. So I think there's a lot of work to be done outside of the tradition necessarily, I think, in order to try to understand what's going on in the Quran. So we see it as a kind of method that really uncovers relationships between different parts of the Quran that otherwise are treated, I think, as separate parts. There's lots of piecemeal approaches in the tradition that might want to just extract verses on women and say, look how women are treated here. Look how it describes the relationship between women and men here. And that becomes an agenda for perhaps some kind of feminist emancipation. But it doesn't work because it throws everything else out.
Right, so we thought we would have a kind of informal discussion, but since we have Professor Ziba Mir Hosseini here, maybe we can start with your impressions on the reading, on the book itself.
This was a book that I was waiting for a long time to read, because as you say that there is a lot about women in Islam, women and Quran, but it's always a part of it and presents a piecemeal. And I loved it because it is chronological. And I always wanted to understand the whole story chronologically. And what is available on the Quran, chronological order, it's really complex. But I think the way that you put it, it allows the story to evolve. And it is an incredible story. It is story, as you said, something which was so important for me, that's something that I have been thinking. And in fact, in my own last book, in conversation with the Muslim reformists, there is this consensus that emerging, the importance of morality and the importance of ethics. There is this belief that Sharia, the law is central idea in Islam. Whereas what emerges is the moral responsibility. And it's God who decides. And law is the consequence of that moral responsibility. So the cosmic, law is mundane, it is human. But at the same time, that moral responsibility is so strong, and it comes across. So that is what I love about the book. And I have other questions that I can ask, but I really want to congratulate you for grounding this and making it. But in the book, you say several times, several chapters in different ways, that the Quran does not separate law and ethics. And also you said that you're using an expansive notion of law. And so I'm confused. What is law and how the Quran does not separate law and ethics? And why you keep on repeating this?
I'll go first on the idea of why law and ethics. I think we're also challenged by the language used by scholarship. We're challenged by the limits of our own scholastic language, which speaks of law in Islam, ethics in Islam, or law in the Quran, ethics in the Quran. So we may not have perhaps overcome that challenge very simply. But let me answer you by reference to the point you just made about morality and law. I think it's unfortunate that we start with law and expect a morality to come from that, whereas you'd think if you had an understanding, a broad understanding of morality, you could then have a much more expansive approach to law. Laws then become much more possible in various forms. What you stipulate that, social relationships are governed by certain things, because the morality is there, the moral vision is there, right? But you can see that the history, I think, of jurisprudence has been that the law comes first and you're supposed to understand morality from it. That, I think, is much more straitjacketing.
So actually, we expanded this point in an article right after writing this book. We've actually picked up on the fact that we didn't fully explain this in the book, and we ourselves grew in our understanding of this exact point right after, immediately after, while the book was in proofs, we were writing the article, right? And so, the thing is about when we say words like law and morality, we might have specific things in mind. It's exactly the same when we say the word patriarchy. We have in mind a certain image of what that might mean. Law, I have in mind the laws of my country that I'm living in, right? Or the laws of any country that I've lived in. And those sorts of laws that are governing a country will govern your behavior. They'll govern your poor behavior. Let's put it that way, right? So if I break the law here in the UK, if I steal an apple, it's breaking the law. If I were to assault somebody, don't ask the wrong question, you might, no, I'm joking. So, if I were to assault somebody, of course, that's worse breaking the law. So you have gradations of badness in the law, and this is correlated with gradations of punishment for that. But in the Quran, what you see is gradations of goodness as well, right? And what we would consider law, an expanded notion of law, might encompass all the Quran's commands. We didn't see, when we tried to figure out, well, what is law in the Quran, we couldn't see a difference between those commands that say, pray, or treat people well, or be nice to, if somebody is aggressive towards you, then respond in the best way, in the most virtuous way. Idfa billati hiya ahsan, We didn't notice a difference between that kind of command and the ones that say, don't eat pork, or those other ones. They're all described using the same kinds of language.
And the same moral urgency.
And the same moral urgency. There's nothing in the Quran that says, this is a law, and yet you shouldn't do that other thing, or you can, that something, that separation is never made. And so then if you count that Quranic, go ahead,
So there is no law in the Quran in what I hear you, it is because the punishment comes after life. You know, it is God who judges what is wrong and what is right. And ethics is about what is right and what is wrong. And morality is about that. But law is quite different.
Well, once we've decided what we're going to mean by law, that's the problem. But no, somebody will throw back at you like the 24, chapter 24, verse 2. Yeah, 2 to 4, 3, 4.
On the adultery, right?
But
Yeah.
I think what we're trying to say is that it's difficult to once you try to separate the idea that turning one's cheek arrogantly against someone is different from not performing your prayer, then you get into trouble trying to understand the moral framework of the Quran.
Yeah.
Like, that matters as much as this matters if it's going to be part of a whole. And I think what's happened in jurisprudence is that we've, it's taken one narrow meaning of what law is. And that's been part of the problem of, I think, understanding the moral framework of the Quran. But it's a thorny issue. I mean, what do we mean by law? There's an instinctive sense of what law is, because if you break a law, there ought to be consequences, right?
Right. And there are only, say, 4 or 5 instances in the Quran where actually these punishments are specified. And of course, in one of those, most famously, the adultery verse, the later Islamic tradition changed the rule, right? I mean, in the Quran, it's that they get some lashes, and in the later jurisprudential tradition, it's that they are stoned to death, And so actually, even though there are 4 or 5 instances of communal punishment for a crime, that didn't even correlate to what later became fiqh, that the Islamic legal tradition, right? So it just calls into question, if we use a word like law in the Quran. I understand your point that, we did go back and forth ourselves, and actually also a colleague who's spoken a lot about law in the Quran, Holger Zellington. Is it all morality or is it all law? And, and yet we couldn't get at. My position at first was it's all morality and none of it's law. But then it's hard to explain the ritual. It's hard to explain things that don't have necessarily a moral consequence for anyone other than the self, like the duty of prayer or something like that, And so then maybe it's all law, but there's not necessarily a difference. It's the problem comes when you try to separate them and you try to say, well, there's a legal realm and an ethical realm. I think that that's extremely problematic in Quranic terms. It's a separation that the Quran itself doesn't ever make. So you can either take it as all one or all the other, but.
I mean, it's useful to divide things. I mean, I once learned this from Sajjad, actually. The Aristotelian imperative of using categories. I mean, we have to use them to make some headway, but I think it also gets us in trouble. We don't see the larger force of the Quranic narrative, where it's headed and how it's getting there. And I think that's what we try to capture.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right. So we have the book itself, and then we have the topic of the book. So perhaps we can spend some time talking about a little bit about the book, but I think we all want to hear about the topic. Can you explain to us what the image of the cover of the book expresses, and how you came to find it and choose it?
This is this wonderful artist, Jumana Madlaj, and she creates these beautiful images. She's, I think, originally Lebanese, but she's in London. She's a local artist, and what she's done here is she's used the root rahma, which is the same root in the Quran for mercy and for the womb. Actually, you have the arham, which is the wombs, and this signifies all ties of kinship in the Quran, and also simply a woman's womb, which are both mentioned in the Quran. And it also is mentioned, over 300 times to talk about God's mercy and God as the merciful one. And of course, interpreters through time have made that connection, that there's like that there's this idea of mercy of womb-likeness in God's mercy, I guess, or you could say, or the other way around, the idea of God's mercy in the womb, or but we just thought she had also made that connection describing this piece of art, which happened to be she was picking up found objects and put them in with the script, and we just thought this idea of in the objects of decaying and life growing up through decay in early spring, and then the mercy and womb elements were just ideal for our book. Yeah, do you want to say anything?
No, because it was all your idea.
Oh yeah, so we loved that.
Thank you. So, you know, for those of you who are students and have not published yet, choosing the image of a book is a very important process, at least for us here. So this was very carefully, you know, selected and searched by Karen, and so we put a lot of care in the images that we choose. Can you share with us something about how you see your approach in the context of other books that may have been written on the subject from different points of view?
Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe some ideological points of view, books written by men, books written by women, by Muslims, by non-Muslims. When we sent this typescript to peer review, one of the reviewers said, "Oh no, another book on women in the Quran." And I said, no, don't worry, this is different. And in the end, it turned out to be different. It's perhaps the most academic book on the subject. It's a very solid project. But how do you see yourselves in the midst of other takes on women in the Quran?
Well, you know, you say in the subject, but what subject are we talking about? Are we talking about women in the Quran, or are we talking about the subject of the Quran? And people writing about the Quran, where they think they're writing about the Quran, and you're in the field of Quranic studies, you're just writing about the Quran, they will often omit or just disregard these verses on women. So actually, on the subject of our book is, in a sense, women and households in the Quran, but it's the real subject of our book is the Quran. And actually, one of the major points that we make in the book is what does happen if you leave out the verses on women and households. You assume there's this long-standing trend, of course, started by Mircea Eliade, right? To think about the sacred and the profane. This has gone through the field of Quranic studies and is still somehow remaining there, even though many years ago, I mean, this has been called into question by many people like Saba Mahmoud and, you know, other scholars who have clearly shown that this is, you know, but in the field of Quranic studies, there are still lingering elements of this idea of sacred and the profane. So all the verses on divorce, all the verses on marriage, all those verses, would these count as theology or as something that you could get saved for, or a sacred moment? No, that's the profane. We don't need to pay any attention to that if we're writing about the Quran's theology or anything like that. And this is exactly how the field of Quranic studies proceeds. How it proceeds is that none of this is taken into account. And actually that's so you know, we can answer also about books on feminism, and that's what Ziba has already picked up on, that we've undertaken a completely different methodology, and this leads us to a different approach. But the major reason that our approach has been different is that we started out with a method and trying to understand it from the Quranic perspective. And to do that, we had to understand the Quran as a larger picture.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that I think we were trying to bring women back to where they belong in the Quranic story.
Yeah.
Which in the Quranic story is not a story about men to men. I mean, it's to whoever's listening, men, male or female. But women have been kind of itemized as a topic of concern in the Quran. The topic of concern in the Quran is what the Quran wants to say to you as a moral individual, which is that, you know, this life is a moral test and so on, and, you know, there's never enough time. Death is impending, and, you know, you have to live a virtuous life, and that goes beyond gender. So I think we're trying to bring all the characters back into the Quranic story, and the women were the biggest kind of, I think, lacuna in that sense, the biggest gap in that story. So because the assumption is that because of the way it's structured, because of the forms of address, of course, it's to do with the level of language as well. It's the sense that it's a text speaking to men in the plural, and then to powerful men, of course, in the plural as well. In the same way that it doesn't speak to slaves directly, but it speaks about them. So there's an assumption, and then those kinds of dependencies, women, slaves, orphans, and so on, come, via the address to men. And so I think we were trying to recalibrate that in some sense, trying to understand what the Quranic story is, in order then to understand all the various parts, whether it's women or men or any other thing. So I think that's been part of the challenge.
So that's, yeah, exactly. It's about kind of putting the Quranic ethics in their historical perspective. And once in order to understand that the Quran has a coherent ethical perspective, you have to look at it within its historical context. And you have to understand, why are women so often in the text? Why are they everywhere? What's going on? Why aren't they left out? In fact, why isn't it a text just about men, to men and other men? And I don't think that this is commonly the perspective that's employed by people writing about the subject. Yeah.
Yes, there's one question, but then I have another question. I think what I really love the way that you engage with the feminist literature, not with all of them, but because there are some feminists, even Muslim feminists, who see Quran as addressing men. The main audience of the Quran addresses are men, and therefore women are marginalized, and they are not there. And you show it very clearly that this is not the case. First of all, when it comes to the moral agency, women have the same moral agency. In ontological, in creation, the same status as men, in afterlife, the same status as men, but at the same time, you make it so clear the hierarchical context. And I love the way, I think this is something very important, because when we talk about family law in our time, the institution of family is so different than what it was. And you make it very clear. Household, and the term that you use, pater familias, the head of the household, who is responsible. And whereas, this extended households very rarely is there. So that is very important. But at the same time, something you say in the book, that egalitarianism is an idea which is alien to the Quran. It's not there. Egalitarianism is a modern idea. And if we expect egalitarianism from the Quran, then we are actually not going to find it, because it was not part of the fabric of the society. It was not an issue in the society, and hierarchy was the order. But patriarchy, it's not that Quran affirms the patriarchy. But to me, it is about justice. And also, justice means different thing in different contexts. It is both context bound and time bound. The same as ethics. The ethics of 7th century Arabia is quite different of our ethics and justice. And equality, especially gender equality, is a very modern idea. So it is totally absent to the fiqh. And also, I would say, to a large part of interpretation of the Quran, and also the theology in Islam. And to me, your book provides seeds of arguing for gender equality. Only the seeds. But I wonder, why didn't you go further to argue for it?
It's a good question. I think we're both convinced that the Quran opens up the way. If you want to go towards gender egalitarianism, go for it. That's the best way. It doesn't. I mean, it's telling the story of moral transformation and salvation in a 7th century context in which there isn't gender equality.
Social equality.
Social equality. But that doesn't mean that it hasn't, in the way that it tells people to become pious and to transform their relationships and how to treat others. It certainly opens the way for that path that you're talking about towards equality. I mean, it certainly makes hints. I mean, if we were, so what did you say? Planting the seeds, but we didn't kind of grow it. I mean, that's what the Quran.
Equality.
Yeah, well, that's what the Quran, I think, is doing in the 7th century for sure. I mean, we've since got rid of slaves.
Yeah, exactly. That's the thing. Like what we were trying to do is explain the Quranic morality in its own context, and that is, I'd say, we were trying to explain why there isn't social equality, even though there's spiritual equality. Why would it be that the Quran doesn't just come out and say, well, let's abolish slavery. Let's just have, everybody just be a free agent, and you can go off. You don't have to live in households. You can be divorced, live alone. And it's just impossible in that social milieu. Like, I mean, maybe abolishing. I don't know about slavery is not my real topic, But in that milieu, the way that people didn't act as individuals, they didn't act solely as an individual entity. Their salvation, of course, their moral choices are individual. Their salvation is based on their individual choices, but socially, nobody was alone. You didn't get divorced and move out and get a flat and live the high life. You got divorced and moved back to daddy's house or your brother's house or your son's house, or you're like, it wasn't a social milieu in which women lived in unprotected circumstances, and the households were supposed to be these places of protection. And that's what we were trying to draw out, is that whereas in our minds, patriarchy might mean a certain thing that it's come to mean because there is a possibility these days of social equality. So of course, patriarchy ends up being the opposite of it. But in a social milieu where that's not even a possibility, maybe there are more nuances to that social structure than we would have recognized if we don't take a close reading. Yeah.
And I also think that when we speak about social equality and gender egalitarianism, and we are so conditioned, I think, by our contemporary structures that we have for the protection of individuals, at least in the places where we're all doing well, that I think that sometimes causes a more scandalous kind of thinking about why the Quran is saying this or that. So I think we also have to temper our expectations of how we extract certain ideas from a text from the 7th century. But I think that's what makes the text so interesting, that it is a historical text, and it is still opens up the way. I mean, I think if we did something as crude as suggest that the Quran could speak to us and come back now, and we told it that we've since emancipated slaves and women have been enfranchised, I think would say, well done. It took you long enough. So I think that's clear from the Quranic message itself.
No, that comes across beautifully what you both of you said in the book, because it's nuanced, but at the same time it enables a different way of thinking. And that different way of thinking is very important. So that is why I said, this is the book that I was waiting for, because it is solid. You provide the methodology. I love it. It is very important. But at the same time, the evidence is there. Yeah. And it is evidence-based. And that makes it, very important, but for me at least.
That was a key point of why it was so important for me. Actually, I did not start with any of these arguments. If you read my first book, which we've talked about it in the past, and we've spoken together on stage together in the past, and I mean, I I didn't know, I didn't have this understanding of the Quran. And I didn't believe it, actually. I started out this book without believing any of the things that I ended up saying in it. And that is because the evidence showed me that this was, and Firas would say something like, well, no, I mean, I can't even remember the things that you used to say. You probably remember them better than me. Life is a moral test. I was like, what? What is that about? Or, or no, you have to trust that there is a type of justice going on here. And this is because of Firas's deep knowledge of the Quran from many years of reading the Quran. And I would say, no, I don't believe you. And luckily we got along well enough that he didn't just hang up the Zoom. It was COVID, right? And so he said, well, let me show you then, And so we came up with the evidence, and that's partly why the book is written the way it was. And say, take the issue of free will. So we were talking about moral agency, and we realized that we needed to discuss the issue of human free will and versus predestination, or at least we needed to mention it, because there was no other way of understanding the Quranic morality. And at first, again, I did not believe this. I said, no, the Quran is incoherent and contradictory on this point. And I was only convinced by the evidence. So this was my own journey of that too.
Yes, it's very clear, because I clearly remember your article on verse 434 and about hierarchy. So reading this, is it the same, Karen? But it actually shows that all of us go through this journey. And you have documented this. So that is a very important.
I wanted to mention something that many of you will not be aware, but there is something in common between Karen and Firas, and perhaps even me. There is a link, and this link is in the dedication of the book. The book is dedicated to Patricia Crona. Now, who was anyway. I won't talk about my own relationship, but. To that giant of Islamic studies. But I want to ask you, so clearly she wrote this famous book, Roman Provincial and Islamic Law on Patronage. And a big concept that you work with in the book is, two ideas. One is working with ideas and concepts of late antiquity, if I may use that term. And I want to ask you how you see that. How important is it to study the text of the Quran in that context? And more specifically, you mentioned the term pater familias, the head of the household, the head of the family. Why are you using a Latin phrase from Roman law to explain the Quran?
Well, I mean, I think we learned different things from Patricia. I think the work that ended up being complementary. I think I certainly learned from her the ability to look for a wider context and a historical wider context, and I think that's really key. It just ends up helping you, because you realize that the Arabs of the Hijaz were just, not that far away from Greco-Roman centers, where established, social structures must have seeped in as you would be culturally, I suppose, contaminated by the centers of cultural civilization. So naturally, I assume that let's try it. Let's imagine that Arabia was a Greco-Roman extension of Greco-Roman late antiquity, and let's read the Quran, and it kind of worked. And it's a kind of, when you think back of it, you think, well, why not? No brainer.
Yeah. There are a few things that I'd add. So first of all, of course, we're by no means the first to think about the Quran in late antiquity. That's but what often happens in the study of the Quran is that it's studied in relation to specific types of late antique discourse, like the religious quote discourse, like those Syriac memory, the Syriac homilies of the church fathers, for instance, very commonly used, brilliant source for the for understanding the wider picture around the Quran. You know, that's great. But what nobody had studied was the social structures. Why not? I mean, households, male-headed households were around, yes, in Greek law, in Roman law. I mean, this had been around for a long time before the Quran, and understanding that social milieu. And a part of the dedication was that in the beginning of our collaboration, we kept saying to each other, how is it that we're collaborating? We're coming from opposite viewpoints, you know? Like, how are we even collaborating on this? What would Patricia Crona have thought about this? Because she was my mentor, and she was a mentor to Firas as well, right? And at different times. And what would she have thought? And then, of course, her Roman provincial and Islamic law takes that institution, the social institution of patronage, right, which is a social institution that goes beyond any specific term of like client and patron. It's got a specific manifestation of clients and patrons. But what it's based around is the whole idea that the wealthy are supposed to look after the poor, that this happens within big households. Households were not just a mother, father, children. A household, a major household, would have had so many other people. It would have had, you know, many, many dependents of that wealthy household, including the slaves and the servants, but also including single women from everywhere, right, who needed a place. And would have included from Roman times the maula, the clients, right? The people who were started calling themselves by the name of the patron, right? And which turns into the idea of adoption, right? You know, those hangers-on that kind of end up being when Patricia wrote about clientage and patronage, she looked at it in its narrow manifestation, and she skipped the Quran because, of course, for her, the Quran couldn't be verified as a historical text because she was a major revisionist, and she was not going to use the Quran as a historical text. And so it was also the dedication is in a way an answer to that. We're like, but look, Patricia, what would have happened if you had used the Quran? What would have happened if you had taken it into account and looked at it in its historical context? Look at the much richer picture that we can get of that entire milieu.
So they offered, I mean, I think that's right. You know, historians like Patricia had offered a possible context for Arabian society, but had not followed it through in the Quran. And there are reasons for that. I mean, there are reasons of the challenge of the Arabic, the Arabic of the Quran, you know, the whole questions of the historicity of the Quran. But I think if you give it the benefit of that, we looked at the text and it's elusive, but once you're working with a model, it begins to kind of correspond. You know, there are hints of this in the Meccan chapters, for example, especially in the apocalyptic kind of sections, passages. You get this sense that there is a wealthy person being addressed, a person with many dependencies, who suddenly lost all privileges, all access to resources. And you might get this in one or two verses. So I can't think of the reference now, but I know the Arabic says, ما أغنى عني مالية هلك عني سلطانية. I mean, the kind of person being addressed here is it just fits that kind of paterfamilias, large household, wealth, resources, Greco-Roman.
These are the words of a person on the day of judgment, and what it says is, you know, my wealth
has not availed me.
Has not availed me, yeah.
And my influence. I mean, Sultan is like an interesting, you know.
Yeah.
My social influence has just withered. It's just gone, disappeared. Yeah, and these things that I don't think they're just like random.
That's not
rhetoric.
random. That's
very specific. So
that's talking to a specific personage in the society. You
kind of do all this detective work.
Right.
I guess.
You're beginning to speak like a couple. Complementing each other.
Yeah. And yes, one question that I wanted what was the challenges of working together? Because doing a book jointly, co-writer to be co-author, it's difficult. how did you work together? Who wrote the first draft, or came through conversations?
Well, it was really interesting. This came about in COVID. I always said, we both had kids at home at that point, and there was such time pressure and such. I would have these 3 days to work, and then I would have to do the homeschooling on the other 3 days. And my husband was looking after the kids on those days, and then I was doing the homeschooling so that he could work. And it was so pressured, like such a pressure cooker. And this incredible thing happened in our conversations, where there was this moment of like discovering something and ease that was like you would expect it to be really fraught. And I'd say maybe like in the moments when it was say about practical challenges, like I don't know, like moments of like all the drafts or the edit or the proofs or the editing insert, the index, for goodness sake, and those practical moments, sure, like then there was loads of tension. Yeah, I won't deny that. But
But I think it was the momentum of the discovery of all of this. I mean, if you're excited by the contents of the book, you can imagine that we were quite driven by that.
You can't imagine like
So
how
I think
incredible
it
it was.
itself, in a sense, yeah.
It's like, but also it was so complementary because I think that I came in with a lot of assumptions from the field of Quranic studies and, peers from that field whose work I've been familiar with for years, and I've been reading them and, wanting to think about their methods. And Firas came in with this depth of understanding of the Quranic text that I could have never matched at that stage, and I could have never, and we might have come in with certain assumptions about each other, but of course we had a working experience together with that anthology. So we knew each other and we could trust each other as, as colleagues. It wasn't that we decided to do a project together and we came together on the project. It's that the project came about. It was a confluence. And in that first year of working together, nothing has ever come easier to me in my entire academic life. Actually, it was incredible. Like we just kept, like I said, the words just kept multiplying. It was like it was writing, it was like nothing. I was just, it was just happening, and then we would talk about it. And yeah, that was amazing. That was an amazing experience. So that was very incredibly positive, I'd say. And the learning curve was so steep, I think, actually for both of us in different ways, maybe. Yeah.
That is actually comes true because it is conversations and collaboration. That makes really the work so rich. And that is one of the values of your book. And I think I don't have much else to say apart from praising your book and also making a complaint.
Wow.
Yes, and the complaint is I think you miss at least about Fazl Rahman. Because you're saying that Fazl Rahman assumes egalitarianism is in the Quran. And therefore, if this assumption is there, and also Fazl Rahman's method is that he basically says his critique of the fiqh and the entire Islamic sciences is that they did not understand the ethics in the Quran, because we don't have such a thing as Islamic ethics or ethics of the Quran. And the fiqh is basically looking at the laws. And he has this double movement methodology and everything. But to me, he doesn't expect egalitarianism, because to me, he understands that there is something deeper in what is being understood as a law. And his method is go back to the Quran and try to separate what he calls it the essence of the Quran, the spirit from the legal. And this is the methodology that all reformists in one way or the other doing, separating the accidental from the essential, or separating all these, different words. But he doesn't expect egalitarianism. But he says that there is a way. If you want to argue for egalitarianism, because it is in our world, you can do it. So I wonder why you misunderstood him. Or maybe I have my own bias about him.
We had a whole thing on Fazl Rahman that we discussed, I think, but I would try to recollect it. But I think if I can slightly offset your reprimand, Ziba, by saying that...
It's a complaint, not...
Yeah, I know. It's by suggesting that when it began to work for us, not to separate any sections of the Quran into this or that, in other words, into a law category or into an ethics category, but we could get a positive reading, a positive result, what one would call a good hermeneutical result. We couldn't separate anymore. I think that's the simple answer, but I don't know if you want to help me elaborate.
Well, I think that it has been a key, as you say, and you know through lived experience, it's a key tenet for reformists to make such a separation and to say, but look, these laws are very specific to that time, but there's a spirit underneath them. And it's not that, I think that, it's not that we specifically disagree with that point of view. It's that what we were looking for is, but what did the Quran mean by those laws in that time? I think we were, and there are moments where we totally agree with Fazl Rahman, but we couldn't like, to have engaged with all the secondary literature. This is, and we hope that our colleagues are indulgent of us if we didn't engage them properly. But they mostly are. Thank you, colleagues. To engage in the kind of depth with all of the people who have written about the Quran, it would have created a kind of a different book. We had to take one kind of essential thing that we thought represented an assumption that many modern people might have, and we had to show where our method was differing slightly from that. Not to discount it entirely, him or his method, which has been useful for so many people, but just to say that actually, because we're looking at the Quran in its historical context, we actively don't want to discard any of it. We just want to see what those things meant, at the time. And then it opens up in a different way. And then, sure, it can be used in this,
Fazl Rahman is a reformer. I'm not sure that we wanted to be we started out as we were not reformers. We didn't have an agenda.
He had a different project. Yeah. And I have that project as well. Yeah. So it is very clear because positionality is very important. It is very important. And you are just trying to understand. And you also complain that, all the anthology of the Quran that you did on the tafsir, it reflects the worldview of the reader. Yeah. Why doesn't this? Why you are exempt from that? Because, at the end of the day, you are reading the Quran through a certain lens. And that lens is your scholarship, your life experiences, your personalities, and everything. So there is no one right way of doing it.
We've thought a lot about the right way. We even were discussing it earlier today. Well, how are we going to answer when somebody says there's no one right way to read the Quran, and your method is just the same as everybody else's method, and I think that
or the opposite, that there is a right way and that's not how you do it.
Yeah, exactly, or the opposite, that you've done it the wrong way. Exactly. Yeah, and people have thought a lot about subjectivity, objectivity, and the academic enterprise, as you know. I mean, because we all have to grapple with where we are as subjects or as subjective parts of our own writing, and our own experiences are informing our writing, and everybody knows that. And I think that what we come to is that we were willing to change our views entirely. In my case, my view changed entirely based on the evidence that we found. Some might argue against our evidence. Like some might say, well, no, the evidence shows something else. If they if they prove to me that the evidence shows something else, I'll change my view again. But so far, this it hasn't changed again. It's this, and I think that that's very different from bringing your subjective experience and saying that the Quran has to say this. It has to conform to my ideals, and if it doesn't, I'm gonna leave parts of it out, and I'm going to look at it in this way, so that or people in the tafsir tradition who were using very specific lenses to look at it because they were assuming that it conformed their school of fiqh or their particular worldview. I'm not saying that they were all bad scholars or anything like that, but it's a wonderful question. It's something that we should all be talking about a lot more. Yeah, go ahead, Raz.
Can I just say something that I feel is very important, which is, like many other topics in the world of Muslim tradition and the history of Muslim tradition, the politics of something has preceded the understanding of that thing. I mean, the politics of the Quran for the 20th century, I think, has preceded as just a simple literary understanding of the Quran. Like you'd read any great work of literature, and you'd get it. You'd get that there's a plot, there's a purpose, there are characters, there's a message. I think that's completely missed for the politics of the Quran. Like who has the right to interpret, who has the right to read, what kind of tools do we need? Do we jettison tradition? Tradition itself is a literary reading of the Quran in some big sense. We've stopped reading the Quran for our times, so where's our literary reading of the Quran? Where's our historical understanding of that? So I think that's, for us, has been really the purpose here with this book.
I want to mention something which I consider is perhaps one of the most controversial points that you make in the book, if I read it correctly. There is an assumption among many people that the Quran, and I'm being quite vague and general here, I realize, that the Quran brings some kind of revolution, that the Quran improves the status of women, or that the Quran does not improve the status of women, or that the Quran brings a spiritual revolution, or that the Quran brings a social revolution, some kind of radical change from the previous time of ignorance and brutality, etc. And yet, one of the points that you seem to make is that while the Quran brings provides or gives moral agency to men and women, it doesn't necessarily give men and women social, not agency, but that improvement or that radical change from established structures. In other words, you seem to be saying that the Quran does not shake the socio-economic structures, but it does shake the moral structures, which include women's moral agency. Is that a correct representation of what you are saying? And if so, or if not, what do we do with that in terms of, can that be manipulated by contemporary readers and say, yes, these authors are proving that women have a certain position in society? And so, is there? Well, this is a different question, which is the contemporary use of scholarship in order to make a political point. Yeah, which is a different question.
I think isn't it always in philosophical discussions and ethical discussions about what is good and what is bad, and what is socially good for people and what is bad? Isn't it more imperative that one looks at the lower threshold? That is, how bad does it have to be for us to think this is very bad? But the good, the other end, that's an open question. Like Omar, social status, how good that can be as good as whatever. It can end up in social egalitarianism and gender egalitarianism. That's the end of the good, but we worry about the baseline, the minimum.
Well, I think we also just have to answer.
For one, that's one part of it. There's another part of that.
Okay, you can go ahead.
No, it's okay. It's about afterlife. It's much more complicated.
Well, no, I'll segue to that.
The other way to think about it is that it's radically different to ask that question that you just asked when there is no sense of the meaning of an afterlife. Like, what did the, if it's a materialistic approach to the here and now, you can ask that question and you will require a certain set of answers. But if you throw in, and it's a big thing to throw in, an afterlife, and that this is a moral test, you can get a different set of answers.
But also, I don't actually think that we're exactly saying that. We don't exactly say that at all, actually. Like what Firas is saying is absolutely right. You know, there is the structure of the afterlife, which structures everything in this life. So all hierarchies in this life would be overturned in the afterlife and replaced by some hierarchy determined by piety. So that doesn't matter about gender, social status, anything like that. So that's the first perspective of the Quran, is that the afterlife structures absolutely everything about your world, or should structure everything about your world. But the second point is not, our intention was definitely not to say that the Quran actually revalidates and is an improper, like, social structure in this world. And one of the things, this is again why we didn't want to separate out law, because actually looking closely at those laws, like, that we perceive as totally unjust and unfair, like the inheritance law, 2 for 1, right? What is it about men getting double what women get? Like, from today's perspective, no way, you know, that's totally unethical. But in a perspective where actually men are needing to look after women, it's their duty. They must do this. And then women are actually also given a provision so that they can't get exploited, or they can't become exploited in that social milieu. So then women are getting their own provision, and they're getting what the men are looking after them with. And I don't mean to sound apologetic for some, you know, what I'm saying is that it was by looking carefully at the laws that we saw that, how to put it, it's not that it's revalidating those social structures. It's that the rules being applied are controlling men's abuses of those social structures, so that there's that once they're being abused, and these social structures, which are inherently prone to abuse, are turned into mechanisms for abuse, then those people have lost everything, you know, by doing that. And so can you put this better than I've been putting it in? Like, I'm somehow losing my ability to speak coherently.
It's a complex question, Omar, but I mean, I think that the Quranic message essentially is that there is agency in this moral trajectory, in this moral journey. And that's not just, that shouldn't be taken as saying, well, okay, stay miserable just because you found moral agency in religious, you know, in piety, for example. No, not at all. I mean, we're establishing baselines.
And you have these key moments where, of course, women have agency that they don't have in modern state structures, like the believing woman who can leave her unbelieving husband and join the community of the believers. For instance, her husband can't say anything about it. She just has the freedom to go. The unbelieving woman who can leave her believing husband, including even in Surat Al-Ahzab, the wives of the Prophet are even given that choice. They're given the free choice to go. He's going to let them go. They make their own moral decisions. And that kind of agency, to give somebody of that social status that kind of agency and say, even a prophet can't control you morally, you have to make your own moral choices, to those women, that is a message to the entire community, saying every single individual has their own choices to make. And then that comes with the social agency of actually choosing, you know, well, we stay in this community and we obey God's laws, or we go to the other community and we don't, you know, but like, you know, that's
and that kind of moment just that you have, and is it in the Tahrim chapter 6?
As well,
the idea that, you know, a male prophet or somebody of authority cannot decide on. That's a radical message in the 7th century. It might not seem exciting now because we have women's rights and we expect women to be absolutely, you know, as human as men. But in the 7th century, that was radical.
Yeah, and it's and also equally the women who had unbelieving husbands, like Pharaoh's wife, is held up as an example of somebody who has made a moral choice for herself that was different from her husband, who's like a classic example of a person who's gone astray in the Quran. So Pharaoh is just the ultimate bad guy, but his wife is a believer and she's saved, because of her own moral choices. And so it's much more complicated than saying, it's a complex question actually. But it's, we absolutely didn't mean to just say that it reifies the same social structures.
And thank you for reminding me. Karen. And this constant displacement between what we expect to be masculine and feminine in the Quran is intentional. It's very important, I think. Just like Karen was saying, we have the wife of Pharaoh, who's a morally upright character, and then we have, so we're constantly displaced in our expectation of what a particular sex means about particular emotional posturing and dispositions. So you get the maternal aspects of certain prophets, the kind of the emotionality of somebody like Jacob or Abraham. And then you get a story that stands apart, like the Queen of the Queen of Sheba. Mary looms so large; it's incredible. How can she be missed? But she is.
But all of these things show, all of these stories show women and men on a moral trajectory, and to separate out the women's stories as though they're only applicable to women, or the wives of the prophet as though they're only models for other women and not for all believers, is a misreading actually of what's actually going on there. Actually, what's going on is that they are showing that no matter what your social status seems to be, or who you seem to be you might think that these women are controlled by people, but they're not. They're making their own moral choices constantly, and so are the men, right? Yeah. So yeah.
I didn't have that impression, when reading it. Those people who are going to complain, they find everything in whatever you do. They are against a certain position. But what I really loved is the importance, the way that you made this qasas, the stories, so powerful, and the plot. It's something that I never came across in reading. So it is very important, and I really encourage all of you to read it, because this is a difficult book, but it is quite readable. And it is readable. The paragraphs are long that I wish you had cut it more, but it is readable. I actually found myself getting up in the morning, wanted to know where are they going next. So that was a sense of, you take the reader with yourself. And so that this is one of the important things that you do in the book. But at the same time, something which is for a reformist like me, who is really interested in law, I want to say that what Mohsen Kadivar is saying about the law in the Quran. So this legislations, he says that whatever law, first of all, he said the Quran is not a book of law, a book of moral, a book of values. And also said all the laws in the Quran were just for their time, standards of the time. They were moral by the standards of the time. They were accepted by people. And they were better and more effective than other laws. So this is the 4 criteria that we need to have for a law which claims to be derived from the Quran. And when you look at the corpus of fiqh, it's non-existent. And in so many ways, I wrote that many years ago, that CEDAW, the Convention Against All Forms of Discrimination, elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, is closer to Sharia than any Muslim family law that we have seen. So because it is just, it makes sense, it is moral, and that is a very important way of reading it. And also reading your book makes this really clear that, yes, that was the best that could have been done at that time. That was totally just at that time. But the question is that we need as a Muslim to ask ourselves, is it just the laws that we have in the name of Islam? Are they moral? Are they accepted by people? No. So I think your book has really implications for law as well, for a reformist approach.
I mean,
Thank you.
Thank you, Ziba. I think this point on morality and law is really crucial. It's absolutely fundamental. You cannot, I hope that most of us agree that it is meaningless to derive morality from laws as opposed to laws from morality, because it's much more expansive this way. In fact, what we have in many contemporary societies are laws without any morality, right? You're not kind of checked for your morality, right? There's just laws that you abide by. But I think the Quran opens it up and says, this is the best morality, and here are some examples of what you could do about it in the 7th century. But it's open.
Yes, but also allows us to understand it in our own context. And that is important, yeah.